So, even as was said, every season that we walk through is opportunities for us to trust God in. In the highs and the lows of life, trust is 100% essential. Dr. Henry Cloud writes in his book, Trust, that we as human beings are wired to trust. Trusting is the most natural and instinctual thing an infant can do. And as that baby grows, we grow up in age through different seasons of life, emotional trust begins to develop in the relationships that we have. This causes our brains to develop and immune systems to function and body to grow. It takes place socially as the child kind of enlarges its borders from just family then to friends and to peers. And trust begets more trust. It continues in our families and professions, communities, and society. Maybe some of you remember in 2008 when the economic markets kind of collapsed and the entire financial system kind of went down, and so everybody's trust went with it, right? Trust is the most important tool that we have in life in every area. Nothing works without it. And that includes our relationship with God. God doesn't ask us to trust him blindly. He asks us to learn and to grow through life in trusting him. But that also is not a one-way road. It's not that God has to work at gaining our trust or that he's on the hot seat of humanity's expectation, that he somehow has to prove himself. Really, he's got nothing left to prove because he went to the cross and he took the punishment for our sin, our irresponsibility. He placed it all on his shoulders, right? I mean, he's got nothing left to prove, yet he invites us to trust him and to see that his ways work over our ways. Solomon, one of the wisest men to ever live, wrote to his son some words of wisdom, putting trust in our security in God. He says in Proverbs 3, starting in verse 1, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart." Solomon's saying, don't forget the instructions of God on your life. And that's more than just knowing the right things. It's an obedience of the heart. A heart that loves God inwardly and from that walks out obedience outwardly. Verse 2, Solomon goes on, he says, "For they will prolong your life many years and bring you peace and prosperity." Wow. There's a benefit to following God's ways. There's a blessing that God establishes in your life. And someone might say, well, I know somebody who loved God and lived obediently, but they died young. Where's the peace and prosperity for a person like that? Well, there's a young man by the name of Brandon Burlsworth whose dream was to play in the NFL. And the problem was he wasn't good enough and he wasn't big enough to play in the NFL. Kind of dampers the dream. It's kind of like my shot at the NBA, all right? But after high school, he went to the University of Arkansas and was a walk-on to try out for the Razorback football team. And it was kind of a long shot for him, but with much endurance, he finally did, and he became their best player in his college career. But even more remarkable was his relationship that he had with God. He wasn't impressed with all the superstar perks of college life, and especially being such a great player on the team. In fact, he decided one night to forego a ring ceremony for the division title that his team had just won, to go home for dinner, to meet his mom, have dinner with her, and then go to a church service right after that night, giving up all the ring for a church service. After his senior year, Burlsworth was picked 63rd in the NFL to the Indianapolis Colts, of where he would go, and they wanted him to be on that team to help win Super Bowls with Peyton Manning and Marvin Harrison. I mean, some great players right there. But the Colts were even more impressed when he showed up for rookie camp. Not only was he better than they thought he was, his character was outstanding. Traveling home one day, though, from camp, he never even played one game in the NFL. About 15 miles from home, his car drifted into another lane, got into a serious accident, and he passed away. Teammates would say, if God ever made a perfect person, it was Brandon. He loved God, honored God, obeyed God, but lost his life young. And some might think, Solomon, you're wrong here. You're wrong. Like, I know people that have followed you and there's no peace and prosperity. But here's the thing, just because you love God doesn't necessarily mean that we don't live in a world that still hurts. And until Jesus comes back, we're still going to have to walk through some of those different things. See, Solomon is actually promising his son here, or is not promising his son, I should say. He's sharing some principles of how to live your life. We got to remember that these aren't the promises of God, but they're the principles of God. We still live in this world that's marred with suffering, and until Jesus comes back, until he vanquishes it all, it's going to be our reality, unfortunately. Verse 3, Solomon says, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will win favor and a good name in the sight of God and man. Wow. That is God's heart for it. It's amazing. It's a life that lives out faithfulness and love. Love and faithfulness. Other translations, they say mercy and truth. And he tells us to bind it around our neck so that those things are covering our hearts. That's the picture that he's giving us. Let love and faithfulness cover your heart. Mercy and truth cover your heart. These are like the twin towers that we find through the scriptures. They come together, love and faithfulness, or mercy and truth. And this kind of the idea of goodness, letting it resonate, not letting there to be falsehood or hypocrisy in our heart, but allow mercy and truth to stay there. Listen, you will never go wrong, ever, if you allow love and faithfulness to be what you live for. As Solomon goes on, I want to get to some of the most popular verses in the Bible. Verse 5, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit or acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. Solomon had discovered that God was worthy of trust in a world that's full of distrust. And he's telling his son, he's telling all of us, trust in the Lord. Now, sometimes my children ask me a question and they say, well, why can't I do this? Or why can't I do that? And sometimes my response is, well, just because. Any other parents out there? Now, that's not the answer that they often want, especially when they want to know why, but sometimes they're not to a place where they can fully understand their dad's reason to why. So rather than explain the answer that they're not yet mature enough to understand, sometimes just because is the answer that they're gonna get. And when I say just because, I'm also saying, hey, you need to trust your dad's love for you here. You need to trust your dad's wisdom in this matter, your dad's understanding and character. And so when I say just because, it's not because I'm trying to keep something from you. It's because you might not fully understand yet, but trust your dad. Again, that's not always what they want, and that's not always the answer that we want, especially when we come to God, when we ask those why questions. But his answer isn't just because. His answer to us is trust because. Trust because I have your best interest in mind. Trust because I'm God and I kind of know the beginning from the end. Trust because I love you so much I don't want you going down that road. Trust because I know how mixed up you can be sometimes in your heart. Trust because I know you so well and I care about all that you're going through. Trust because I'm God and I actually know what's ahead of you. Just hold on to me. See, when we don't trust God, we're left to our own vices, our own controls, our own abilities, and we put our trust in everything else. It's kind of the ongoing saga of the people of Israel. God proven himself trustworthy over and over again, yet they failed to trust his promises for their lives. There's one such prophet, his name was Elijah, and he asked the people of Israel once, how long are you going to be limping back and forth between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer. So they went back and forth, limping between two different opinions because it's so easy to do. We often have escape clauses in our relationship with God. We've got open-ended opinions where we allow ourselves the freedom to choose God or not choose God, depending on what's wise in our own eyes. We've got contingency plans that we put in place so that we don't have to fully trust God. We can trust ourselves. So often our circumstances pull against God's promises, and that's when we make plan B, just in case God doesn't come through for us like we want him to. But that's not really trust. Trust is throwing your whole weight on the Lord and expecting he's not going to drop you. Now, years ago, I did a lot of rock climbing and rappelling. And I can't say I'm an expert at that, but I can remember the first time that I rappelled off an 85-foot cliff. Half of the cliff kind of jutted out and ever so slightly, so you couldn't exactly see the ground below you. But you knew it was there, and there's kind of this cavernous area under this big cliff. And so it took me a little while to work up the courage to kind of step backwards over the cliff and kind of figure this out and like, can I trust these ropes, you know? Can I trust the person that's actually helping me here, right? But as I started to inch my way back, you have to put your full weight on that rope to trust that it's actually going to catch you, or you're going to have other problems. You're actually going to probably slide down that rope, scrape yourself up quite a bit. You're supposed to kind of sit back and put your butt out when you're doing it so you can jump off the cliff as you're kind of rappelling downwards. But the whole key to it is putting your trust in that rope. When God says, trust me with all your heart, that's like trusting that rope on your way down of a rappel. You got to put all of your weight on God to save you or guide you or teach you or show you. If you can't put all your weight on God and be confident in him, then no matter what your circumstance is and the promises that he said, then you're kind of showing God that you don't trust him. If you can't trust him with all your heart, which we all have a hard time doing sometimes, and you'll probably find that maybe there's some distrust in there. It's up to us to discover why. Why don't I trust God? Has anybody ever been here before that you just don't trust God? God, I'm not sure I trust you here. I'm not sure I trust what's going on here. See, we often trust in our own ways and abilities and distrust God because we think he failed to meet my expectations. We all have expectations of God, all of us, every single one of us. And we often are in this battle of belief. It's difficult. It's not easy to walk through those things. But the reality is sometimes it happens. David writes, and later Jesus quotes when he's on the cross. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. See, when our expectations of God are not met, we often feel forsaken, and even Jesus felt this a bit. And even Jesus sympathized with every feeling that we go through, even the feelings of being forsaken by God. Jesus, the Son of God, knew the plan that he and his Father from the beginning of time, before the foundations of the earth, put into place, and yet he still felt this forsakenness. He still felt this disappointment. He still was saying, God, where are you? A life verse of mine that is a consistent chorus in my heart is out of Proverbs 19:21 that says, many are the plans in a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. It's hard sometimes to delineate between the plans in my heart and what God's purpose is, but to be honest, they don't always line up. And sometimes we push our plans over God's plans in our lives, and sometimes the result comes down with some maybe faulty expectations of God. In John chapter 5, there's a man who was sitting beside a pool of water. And it's in Bethesda. And just by the way, I'll throw this out here. I'm just getting the dates in. But April of next year, we're planning on doing a trip to Israel. And we'll go see this place in Bethesda. So if anybody's interested, that information will be out in a couple weeks. Pretty excited about that. But this man was sitting by this pool of water of Bethesda. And he was hanging out there. And he was hanging out there for a long time. Scripture says that he was there for 38 years. Now listen, that's a long time to hang out by some water. I mean, we haven't even waited 30 years yet for the Bills to get back to the Super Bowl. 38 years? Come on. Jeez, right? Jesus found him. He said, hey, do you want to get well? The man replied, well, I've got nobody to help me when the waters get stirred, get into the water. You know, this is funny about it. He didn't say, well, absolutely I want to get well. No, rather he said something different. He said, no, I don't have anybody to help me here get into the waters. You see, there was kind of a myth that they believed back then that when the waters stirred in this pool, that an angel of the Lord was stirring these waters, and anybody who was in first got healed. Now, I don't think that's God's heart. Like, you know, he's stirring these waters, and, you know, you got some people that aren't able to walk, some people that are deaf and blind, and he's just like up there for show. Whoever can get there first is going to get healed, right? That's not God, right? And so I think they had some false expectations of what this pool of water could do. Not only that, he had some false expectations. I don't have anybody around me that's going to help me to get to where I need to go. All of these things kind of just weighed on this man, and that was his answer. You see, life himself, healing himself, the power of God himself was standing in front of this crippled man. And he's talking about trying to get into this pool of water. Sometimes God's right in front of you, but our expectations are in Bethesda. Sometimes we decide for God. Sometimes we actually tell God all the ways our expectations are not met. But God lives outside of our expectations. See, all of this little story in John 5 really was to fulfill what Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 35, 5 and 6, hundreds of years earlier, because God's purpose always prevails. And the question is, we have to evaluate in our own lives. Are my expectations of God healthy? Have I distrusted God with my expectations? Listen, distrust in and of itself is at an all-time high in society. Edelman, a leading global communications marketing firm, published a yearly trust barometer that talked about last year, 2022. It said that distrust is now society's default emotion. Nearly 6 in 10 say their default tendency is to distrust something until they see evidence that it's trustworthy. I mean, that's over 60% of society. That's our emotion, is distrust. Another 64% say it's now to a point where people can't even talk with other people or have a disagreement with other people, and distrust just fuels all of that, right? It goes on, this report says that government and media fuel this cycle of distrust, and most people, about 50%, don't even trust those institutions. There's a lot. Distrust is at an all-time high. And so when it's at an all-time high, and it's kind of the lay of the land, sometimes that can also get in our own hearts towards God. Sometimes we miss it. Not only that, all these things just fuel the cycle of distrust, all of what Isaiah said. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter to sweet and sweet for bitter, who have exchanged it all. We live in a time where evil is being called good and good is being called evil, where normal is being ridiculed and abnormal is being tolerated and celebrated, where confusion is being praised and wisdom is being laughed at. I mean, what is going on? Where kids are being influenced and coerced to change their God-given genders for someone else's profit and tolerance. We're in times of great distrust. With everything going on in the world around us today, just when you think things can't get crazier, they get crazier. Paul talks about this in 2 Thessalonians 2, where wickedness will deceive those who are perishing. And they perish because they refuse to love the truth and be saved. It's their own choosing. And for this reason, it says that God sends a strong or powerful delusion to believe the lies because they've delighted in wickedness and because they've chosen not to trust God. It all comes down to trust. Where do you distrust God in your heart? You know, there's plenty of reasons why we distrust God. First one is because maybe unanswered prayer. We don't get those prayers answered. Anybody ever not get your prayer answered before? Come on, right? What's up with that? God, you tell us to always pray and God to seek your heart, but Lord, it doesn't seem like you're meeting me here, right? Sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers because maybe he gives people volitional freedom. He's not going to force people to choose him, to choose what's right and good. Sometimes he doesn't answer prayer because maybe our requests aren't God's best. Sometimes God doesn't answer prayer because maybe the affliction that we're going through is there to change us if we submit to him. There's different reasons God doesn't answer prayer. But ultimately, prayer is a time where we turn away from ourselves and we turn to God. The true value of prayer is communion with him. Another reason we distrust God is our self-interests. Self-interest kind of flips us into the driver's seat and God into the passenger seat. When we start to look at our own self-interest, it's like, okay, God, I got this. You drive over there. But the problem with that is we take the driver's seat back, we get lost real quick. And our paths are here, there, and everywhere. They're not straight on. The Bible says our hearts can be deceitful above all else, and we can easily start magnifying our own self-interest. Another way that we distrust God is value differences. Simply put, God values, they don't always line up with our values. Remember the rich young ruler? He wanted to follow Jesus, but Jesus put a value out there, and he just couldn't quite get down with it. He said, I'm sorry, and he went away sad. Sometimes we also disagree with how God does things. We disagree with his sense of morality. In fact, sometimes we condone what he condemns. And when we disagree with God's truth and we open the door, then to moral relativism, where we start deciding what's moral and what's not. We start cutting and pasting in place of his principles and precepts. Now more than ever, that door is wide open. Another way that we can distrust God is the unfairness of life. I don't know about you, but it's easy to see the unfairness of a referee when he calls something against my kid's sports team. I don't seem to mind it as much as if they miss a penalty that my kid's team does, right? We all have our own ideas of fairness of life to make things, and we want God, the greatest referee, to make things fair. Growing up, I'd see my parents do things and give things to my much younger sister. And I'd say, what's up with that? You didn't do that for me when I was younger. Why didn't you do this for her? And I complained, and my dad would just look at me and say, well, we love her more. Scarred for life. And we all know that's not true. I mean, how could they not love me the most, right? But sometimes we miss all of God's blessing because we're too fixated on what others have. Peter was too busy wondering about John's life. Jesus shares a parable as well that of unfair wages, where some people thought they got gypped by God, and God's like, listen, it's mine to give. It's mine to give. Why do we begrudge what God gives us? It's often because we look inward. We look inward to what we can get, and we kind of judge things according to everybody else and all the systems of the world that's out there. Psalm 118 says it's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. We evaluate our trust based on what we get in this world rather than taking refuge in God. So Solomon tells us to trust in the Lord with all of our heart, not some of it, not most of it, all of it. And to lean not on our own understanding. How many times have my own understanding gotten me in trouble? Sometimes I walk into the door of my house coming home from work, and I see things, and I see how the house isn't what I expected it to be, and all these different things are going on. I start making some comments. I get a little frustrated. And then my wife later on, my precious wife, tells me later on all of the different things as to why the reasons were for this and that. And then I feel very, very little, and I'm also in trouble because I made those comments before, right? Because I'm leaning on my own understanding of what my eyes see without getting the understanding first. I'm self-supporting. But Christ calls us to not lean on our own understanding, but his. I was at an invitational track meet when I was in high school and running the 400 hurdles. And coming around the 200 to 300 mark, I came over the hurdle with the wrong lead leg, came down and did this to my ankle. Oh man, it killed me. I fell off the track and got back on and finished the race and just laid it out after that. Next month and a half, I had to use one of these guys. Who else has used a crutch before, right? And you got to put your weight into that crutch, right? Because you can't use that ankle, right? That's kind of how it works. And you put all of your weight on. You're trusting this thing. In order to heal it up, I had to keep the weight off of my ankle and put it onto the crutch. And it's the same kind of thought, to lean not on our own understanding, but lean on His. If I want wholehearted trust in my life for God, then it starts with surrendering my own self-dependency. I've got to lean on Him in life. I've got to do that. And not only that, with leaning surrendering our self-dependency, it takes a lot of trust to do that. It takes a lot of trust to actually lean into God here. That's what He calls us to. 1 year ago this month, Ben and I, he coerced me into going skydiving. It was a goal of his after he lost a certain amount of weight, in which he crushed that, and so I said, sure, I'd go, and that's really the only reason that I went, all right? I'm just going to be honest. Didn't really have a desire myself, but I was glad I did, because I loved it. But people ask me, why would you, do that? And, were you scared? And, the only time that I was scared, or that I was a little bit nervous, was actually when I was sitting in the plane and I watched Ben jump out. I'm like, you shouldn't do that. Like, it just was like that kind of thought, like, bro, no. I almost ran out and, I didn't, but I was gonna. That's what it felt like in there, So then it was my turn, and so, you're jumping out of a plane. Now, I wasn't really scared. I don't know if it's the 10,000, 12,000 feet up in the air type of thing. Just didn't seem like, it was real. But there I jumped, and I had to really lean on the instructor, right? I had to trust that he knew what he was doing. I still don't understand why he had a helmet and I didn't, but we'll get there. But you gotta give up your own dependency sometimes and say, okay, God, I trust you. You got this. Another thing that Solomon wants us to do as we acknowledge Him and lean not on our understanding is to invite God to counsel us daily. You see, sometimes when we're walking with Christ, we're walking in this relationship with God, we can actually miss some things in our lives because we just get busy with life. And before we know, we're drifting away from God. And yeah, we know the truth and we know what's right and all those types of things, but we haven't had that counsel from God every day. That's God's desire for us. And there's so much counsel from everything else out there. We got friends that'll give you an opinion. We got all these different things out there, but God's like, look at my counsel. If not in principle, in precept, God covers everything in this book. It won't fail, and He won't fail you with what He says. The last thing, as Solomon is writing his son, he says, don't be wise in your own eyes, shun evil. So in order to really trust God, you have to retreat from participating in evil while pursuing Christ-likeness. And here's the thing, you won't ever have a problem of not doing evil if you're pursuing Christ, because you're focused on Him. And I'm not talking about all the big bad evils out in society. I'm talking about the evil that can take residency up here and in here. Those things that we can allow, maybe anger to hold us, maybe fear, anxiety, maybe jealousy, maybe lust. All those things, it starts in the heart. Solomon say, don't let that get in here. Trust in the Lord. Don't listen to those things that are getting lodged in there. You got to turn away from that. You got to run away from that. And you got to pursue Christ with your life. Jesus is waiting to be pursued by you. And He died on the cross so that He could have a relationship with you. Listen, if somebody's going to die for me, for all my mess, all my failure, all my sin, all my shame, all my suffering in life, if somebody's going to put their life on the line for me, I'm going to give them my trust. And today, there might be somebody in this room that really hasn't given your heart to the Lord in that way. I just want you to know that Jesus Christ, He came to forgive you of your sin. He died on a cross for that, taking the punishment that really was owed to us, because sin brings death. There's consequence to sin. It destroys. But Jesus took that on Himself. The amazing thing about Jesus is it didn't stop there. He then defeated death, and He rose 3 days later. And He offers anybody who would simply believe and trust their lives to Him to have a relationship for eternity. For eternity. It's not about how good you are. It's not about how great things you do. It's not about all the works that you can do in this world. Jesus said that's not it at all. The one work that you have to do is to believe in me, Jesus said. To trust in me. So it doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter what you've done. Trust in Him. And He's got you then. He takes care of you then. He holds you then. You can put all your weight into Him. Amen. If anybody wants to know more about having that personal relationship with Jesus Christ, we'd be happy to talk with you after service. But right now, I'm just going to simply ask that everybody stand right now. And I want to just throw it out here to you. Where have you distrusted God in your life? Where have you put your trust in other places? Is there any distrust of God in your life, in your heart? If so, let's take this time right now just to bring that to the Lord. Let's ask Him to help us grow in trust through those areas of our lives. Can we do that right now? Can we just have some God time, just bring what's in our heart to Him right now in this moment? Can we do that? Just a minute, I'll dismiss you, but let's just take a moment right now as God just wants to work in our hearts and our lives.